Thanks, Rahul, and thanks to all of those in this panel who preceded me. I'm by far one of the least auspicious here, and I really appreciate, maybe by accident, being the last one on the panel. I feel very honored to be following you all, and hopefully to be capping off this conversation with something that is not necessarily more or less important, but is more concrete in terms of what Opower is different than the rest of the panel, and that's that we are actually deploying a technology that is, I think OATI is doing this also, but we're deploying a technology that is making visible a lot of the value that comes off not just smart meter data, but really how customers can participate in a robust and smart way with the grid as it stands, not even with necessarily a smart grid, but by virtue of the fact that information technology has come along so far in the past 10 to 15 years. It's just taken a little while for the utility industry to sort of apply that technology to its everyday problems. And so I think, before I begin, I was asked to talk about energy efficiency and demand side management. That is what Opower has done as its bread and butter, is provide those kinds of outcomes as one of the things that we do when we do customer engagement with utilities. But I think it's worth standing back. I've heard you all speak, and I think whether it's the New York REV process that was mentioned by a couple of the earlier panelists, or whether it's the kind of transformation that India must undertake, and that I feel inspired by hearing you all describe. The utility, the distribution company, as has been mentioned before, really stands at the center of these transformations. Whether it becomes obsolete in 50 years or 10 years, or whether it becomes something else, or whether it becomes the leader of the transformation in terms of how implementation goes, is an outstanding question, but it's one that I think we'll all answer together over the course of the next generation. And that is, I think, very closely tied with how we address climate change and how we address equitable access to energy, as well as sort of the more humdrum daily questions that we face as regulators and utilities and vendors who serve them. So what I had proposed to talk about, and I don't think I'm going to do this for very long, is to look at a specific case study. So Baltimore Gas and Electric is a utility in the East Coast of the United States. It's in Maryland, obviously. Baltimore is sort of a larger, older city in the US on the East Coast. They have about 1 million customers. And they're one of the Exelon utilities, which is seen as a leader by many. But importantly, they undertook a smart meter deployment through US government financing. So again, the central government there was helping the state governments and the state entities to provide the same kind of transformation, not in the same scope or scale, but of the same nature. And the key thing here is that the reason I wanted to describe this case study is not because Opower has helped, or not because it's a really cool, interesting thing that we've done, but because the regulatory relationship with the distribution company was one of creativity and innovation and leadership. And it was one where it started off as an caustic way, and then became something very productive, and has become a beacon, I think, for how we think about taking the data that comes off of any meters, but specifically smart meters, and using it to deliver measurable outcomes that have value to the customers themselves, the people who are the voters, and the people who are the ratepayers, the people who ultimately the system is made to serve. The quick version is that they got about half of the money they needed to create the smart meters for everyone from the federal government. And yet they still were rejected when they went to the Maryland Public Service Commission, which is the equivalent of an ERC, because the ERC, the Public Service Commission, basically told them that there weren't sufficient customer benefits that were measurable and visible to make it worthwhile, even for a wealthy state like Maryland, to partake in something as potentially risky as a smart metering investment. And so what Baltimore Gas and Electric did is they said, well, you know what, we're going to create a business case that will take the meter data and not only serve it back to customers in a visible format that drives real measurable outcomes in terms of both energy efficiency and demand response, demand side management, but also, we will take a buy on financing this today, and in 3 years we'll come back to you and tell you how we've done, and only then will we have cost recovery. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what should always happen, but it's an important note that, as we talk about cost recovery and mechanisms, there's risk involved in these things, but it requires leadership on both parts, the distribution company and the regulator, to lead, to show how this can be done. They had done pilots before, but really what Maryland stands to do now is become a pilot for the rest of the US and potentially for other countries around the world, especially as meter costs come down. Like this pie chart shows you basically how they structured the business case from the beginning. This is for meters when they cost something like $200 a meter. That cost has already come down for comparable meters, and obviously it would come down further if we simplify the meter to meet a certain kind of use case and if we do them at scale. But the visibility of the data, what smart meter data comes to create is really accountability.
Was this the pre-business case or the actual?
This is the pre-business case.
Pre, yes.
The outcome, and this is, so it's $2.5 billion worth of value. That's approximately what they came back with. The end case, so I can sort of skip to the end here. I won't go through this whole thing just for the sake of time, but in the end, I think it broke down to about 50-50 for operational benefits and for demand-side management and energy efficiency. But it's still, they came back with $2.5 for every dollar spent. So something like a 250% return on investment from smart metering that was measured through comparing basically how people who got certain interventions compared with those who did not, and time, how people's behavior changed over time in response to timely information. So I'll just kind of brush through these quickly. I think that there's an importance here of education, right? I think that Mr. Saxena mentioned very wisely that visualizing the value to people, getting them on board before you really even give them a meter, and then keeping them on board while you're doing the implementation is critical to making sure that you don't have a pitchfork-wielding mob who doesn't think or thinks that there's cancer coming off the meter or that it's much too expensive. All of these decisions have to be taken before you invest, but it's important to bring your customers with you. And that's something that Baltimore Gas and Electric did as part of its customer engagement plan. I think the customer engagement plan that's in this model smart grid regulation is a very important factor, but words on a page are not sufficient to describe what's necessary for the local market conditions and making sure that people on the ground in that market understand what's going on. And so that's where the distribution company will have to think about tailoring this kind of a thing. But basically it's the idea of welcoming customers to the personalized experience that becomes available with more data, and then giving them access to a kind of information and tools that would have been unaffordable, if not even unavailable 10 years ago, that are actually fairly cost effective, especially at scale. And then these are products that we do, but this is not that important. The point is that it creates the ability to create time-specific messaging to people at the moments that matter, not just for them, but for the grid. And so what I'm going to show you now is, I think, what is the real outcome from an implementation standpoint of this innovation between the regulator, the distribution company, and my company to create what's basically a dynamic tariff. It's a peak time rebate program that reaches all 1.1 million of those customers today. It took about 3 years to phase up from 300,000 meters per year, basically. And it basically is, when they install the meter, they get the information from the person about how they want to be communicated with, whether it's IVR, whether it's email, whether it's SMS. So they have the ability to communicate in real time with almost everybody on their grid. And the smart meter data and weather predicting, all the things that they use to forecast load and determine when they would have a critical peak are all kind of part of the same system now. And they can recruit individual households in a way that may not be as load controllable as an ADSM mechanism, but is potentially more reliable from the sense of scale, because you don't have to have people take this thing up voluntarily. You're just serving it to them as an enhanced level of service. Anyway, this is what happens. I'll show you a quick visualization. So what you're seeing right now is Baltimore from afar. This is a sort of a Google Maps image. All of the yellow dots here are direct load control devices. So it happens that BG&E has always been very in the fore of these things. These are all air conditioning switches. And you can see there's many of them. It's the biggest in the country. Oh, that didn't work. Hold on.
Is that global warming? Ice melting?
This is supposed to be impact, but my video is not working. Well, okay. So if the video were working, what you would see is a bunch of sort of different colors popping up, and that's communications happening in real time the day of a peak event, before the event, and then when the event is occurring, that are 10 times more than this number. So it's basically covering the entire territory. And this picture is supposed to show you what the impact of that is. So it's a heat map that shows you how the consumption is going down over the course of a 4-hour peak event. And the whole of the territory basically turns red, indicating that there is something like 5 to 15% peak impact reduction as a product of this time-specific personalized information. This took a power plant off the grid effectively, an old coal plant. This is basically what the impact is in Maryland. Clearly Maryland is not India, but you can see the scale here is still pretty big. And you know, the broader point here is that India is different than Maryland. There will not be a uniform approach that works today for everybody in India, but there are enough people and enough different state-level utilities to think about leadership in different ways and to start thinking about segmenting how you want to pilot different approaches that have worked in other places using innovations that are local to your problems. And I think that that's what is really exciting for our company and I think for the world. So I'll stop there, but thank you for the time. And
thank you.